In the first week of January 1945, a German intelligence officer attached to Army Group B sat in a cellar in the Eifel region, reviewing order of battle reports from the Ardennes. His name was Hauptmann Werner Drexler, and his job was to track American divisions. He knew their shoulder patches, their commanders, their regimental designations, their combat histories. He had watched them for months. And now, in the middle of the greatest German offensive since 1940, something in his reports did not make sense. The Fourth Infantry Division was on the line again. Drexler had tracked this division since Normandy. He had documented its losses through the Hürtgen Forest in November, where it had been ground down to a shell. His own reports, drawn from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and frontline observation, showed that the 4th Division had suffered over 5,000 battle casualties and another 2,500 non-battle losses from trench foot, frostbite, and exhaustion in a single month. Its 22nd Infantry Regiment alone had lost 2,773 men, 85% of its authorized strength, in 18 days of fighting. Rifle companies had been destroyed and rebuilt again, until the regiment had bled through more men than it was designed to hold. By every calculation Drexler understood, this division was finished. A formation that had lost that many infantrymen, that many sergeants, that many company commanders, could not simply reappear at fighting strength a few weeks later. That was not how armies worked. That was not how his army worked. And yet the 4th Division was fighting on the southern shoulder of the German penetration, defending Luxembourg, and, according to every report crossing his desk, it was fighting effectively. Not brilliantly, perhaps, not with the ferocity of a fresh formation, but it was there. It was shooting back, and it was holding. He checked his files again. The 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division from Pennsylvania, had been mauled even worse. Nearly 6,200 casualties in the Hürtgen Forest, then placed on a 25-mile front in Luxembourg to rest and absorb replacements. When the German offensive hit on December 16th, the 28th was supposed to be a spent force, a placeholder on a quiet sector. Instead, its 110th Infantry Regiment had fought a desperate 3-day delay along the ridge road the Americans called Skyline Drive, burning through 280,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, 5,000 mortar rounds, 3,000 grenades, and 300 bazooka rockets. The 28th had been broken twice in 2 months and was still killing Germans. Drexler could not find the explanation in his files, because the explanation was not a weapon, not a tactic, not a new piece of equipment. It was a system. And it was a system the German army had no equivalent for and no framework to understand. If this story matters to you, if these men and the systems that carried them deserve to be remembered, a like or a subscribe helps this reach others who care about what really happened. That is all I will ever ask. What Drexler was watching, and what German intelligence officers across the Western Front were watching that winter, was the visible output of something the United States Army had built years earlier and thousands of miles away. It was called the Individual Replacement System. It was hated by nearly everyone who passed through it. It was criticized by generals, cursed by the soldiers it processed, and later called by one historian the Army's greatest failure of the war. And it won the war anyway. Because whatever it did to the men inside it, whatever it cost in morale and human dignity, it did one thing that no other army on earth could match. It kept shattered divisions in the fight. It replaced the dead and the wounded and the frozen faster than the enemy could kill them. And it did it continuously, automatically, at industrial scale, month after month, from Normandy to the Rhine. But before we get to how it worked, and why Germany could not replicate it, we need to go back to a place called Fort McClellan, Alabama, in the spring of 1943, where a young draftee was learning what it meant to become a replacement. His name was Elvin Cox, and he kept a diary. On his first day at the Infantry Replacement Training Center, he was assigned to a squad of 12 men, organized alphabetically. He recorded his designation with the precision of a man who understood he was being processed. Second man of the 3rd Squad, 3rd Platoon, Company D, 31st Battalion, 8th Regiment. He was issued an M1 Garand rifle and a gas mask. He learned the general orders. He practiced guard duty, gas mask drills, and field pack discipline. He trained for 17 weeks, and then he was shipped overseas as a replacement, which meant he was no longer Elvin Cox from wherever he came from. He was a body. A rifleman-shaped unit of manpower, ready to be inserted into whatever hole the war had opened. This was the system that General George Marshall and Lieutenant General Leslie McNair had designed from the Army Ground Forces headquarters. The logic was brutally simple. In a war fought across oceans, you could not rotate entire divisions home to rebuild. You could not ship fresh divisions fast enough to replace broken ones. The shipping alone would have consumed months that the war did not have. So instead, you kept every division in the line permanently and fed individual soldiers into them one at a time, the way a factory feeds parts into an assembly line. When a man was killed or wounded, a requisition went back through the chain. A replacement was pulled from a depot. He was trucked forward. He was inserted into the squad. The division never stopped fighting. McNair understood something about infantry casualties that most planners had underestimated. By February of 1944, his statistical team had produced a finding that would shape every decision that followed. In the Italian campaign, infantry soldiers made up only 11% of all American military personnel in the theater. But they had suffered 60% of the total casualties. The other 89% of the Army, the artillerists, the tankers, the engineers, the truck drivers, the quartermasters, the clerks, was bleeding at a fraction of the rate. The war's true consumption was concentrated in the rifle squads, the small units of 12 men who closed with the enemy at ranges where bullets, mortars, and shrapnel did their work. Everything McNair built was designed to feed that consumption, not to stop it, not to reduce it, to sustain it indefinitely. The system began at the infantry replacement training centers scattered across the American South. Fort McClellan in Alabama, Camp Wheeler near Macon, Georgia, which at its peak held 17,000 trainees and 3,000 instructors. Camp Roberts in California, Camp Blanding in Florida, Fort Walters in Texas. The training cycle ran roughly 17 weeks of basic and advanced infantry instruction, including live-fire exercises, simulated urban combat, and the experience of crouching in a foxhole while a Sherman tank drove over it. The men who graduated from these centers were not specialists. They were standardized, trained to a uniform baseline, interchangeable. From the training centers, they were shipped to ports of embarkation and loaded onto transports. They crossed the Atlantic as anonymous replacement drafts, hundreds of men who did not know each other, headed for units they had never heard of. When they arrived in Europe, they were processed through replacement depots, the infamous Repeldepots, staging areas where men waited, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to degrading. The men slept in tents or barracks, ate in mass halls, and waited for their names to appear on a shipping list. They had no unit, they had no mission, they had nothing to do except think about what was coming. A reporter who visited one of the larger depots later wrote that Repeldepots were dreary places, where men sat in the mud waiting to be sent somewhere they did not want to go. The 16th Reinforcement Depot at Compiègne, France, was one of the larger ones. It had been retraining rear echelon troops as riflemen since November 1944, a sign of how desperate the need had become. By late 1944, the Army had renamed the entire system. Replacements were now called reinforcements. The Ground Force Replacement System became the Ground Force Reinforcement Command. The word replacement had become so toxic, so associated with expendability and anonymous death, that Eisenhower ordered it erased from the vocabulary. The men who passed through the system noticed the new name. They did not notice any change in the system itself. From the depot, a replacement was forwarded to a division rear area, and from there to a regiment, a battalion, a company, a squad. He arrived knowing no one. He knew nothing about the unit's history, its habits, its leaders, its rhythms. The veterans in the squad often refused to learn his name, not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. Too many replacements died in their first 48 hours of combat. Learning a dead man's name was a cost no one wanted to pay twice. This was the system's great flaw, and everyone who touched it knew it. Replacements arrived as strangers, and often died as strangers. They had no bonds with the men beside them. They had no institutional memory of the unit. They were, in the bitter phrase that soldiers used, spare parts. After the war, the historian Stephen Ambrose called the system inefficient, wasteful, and possibly the cause of unnecessary deaths. Another historian quoted a combat soldier who said he wanted to watch the staff officers responsible for the replacement system lined up and shot after the war. But here is what you need to hold in your mind, because this is the hinge of the entire story. The system was terrible for the individual, and it was unbeatable for the army. Remember that distinction, because it explains everything that follows. By the autumn of 1944, the math of the replacement system had become the most important equation in the European theater. Infantry made up roughly 11% of all American military personnel in the theater, but infantrymen were taking 60% of all casualties. Rifle companies were being consumed at a rate that no one had predicted before D-Day. In the Hürtgen Forest alone, an infantry regiment could sustain 100% casualties in 3 months. Some rifle companies lost 100 to 200% of their original strength in a single week. The men who landed on the beaches in June were being replaced, and replaced again, and replaced again, and the divisions they belonged to never came off the line. The Fourth Infantry Division was the clearest example of what this looked like in practice. Under Major General Raymond Barton, it had fought from Utah Beach through the hedgerow country and into the Hürtgen Forest in November of 1944. The forest was a killing ground. Dense pine trees turned artillery bursts into storms of wooden splinters that shredded men in their foxholes. The undergrowth was so thick that flanking movements were measured in yards, not miles. The 4th Division's 22nd Infantry Regiment, the Double Deucers, entered the Hürtgen on November 16th with roughly 3,200 men. 18 days later, it came out with fewer than 500, who had not been killed, wounded, or evacuated for trench foot and exposure. The regiment had lost its 3 battalion commanders within 3 days of each other. An after-action report from the 8th Infantry Regiment, written months earlier during the Normandy campaign, had already warned that companies could not maintain the fighting standard of seasoned assault troops when their ranks were being diluted with inexperienced men. In the Hürtgen, that dilution reached a point where some platoons were composed almost entirely of replacements who had arrived that same week. And yet, the 4th Division absorbed its losses, received its replacements, and was placed on what the staff considered a quiet sector in Luxembourg to rest and rebuild. When the bulge struck, it held. Consider what that means. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, suffered more than 200% total casualties during the war. That means the division was, in effect, wiped out twice over. Every single position in the unit was filled and emptied and filled again, not once, but more than twice. And yet the 1st Infantry Division was never pulled from the order of battle. It never ceased to exist. It fought from North Africa to the Elbe River without interruption, because every time a man fell, another man arrived to take his place. 18 American divisions in the European theater suffered more than 100% total casualties. 5 of them, including the 1st, suffered more than 200%, and every one of those divisions was still fighting at the end of the war, still near full strength, still operationally effective. The system that everyone hated had done the one thing it was designed to do. It had kept the line unbroken. But by December of 1944, even the pipeline was straining. The crisis had a name among the staff officers who tracked it. They called it the infantry replacement shortage, and the numbers were staggering. On December 8th, before the German offensive had even begun, the European theater projected a shortfall of roughly 23,000 riflemen by the end of the month. In Patton's Third Army alone, November had produced 38,510 casualties, against only 26,981 replacements received. By the 1st of December, Third Army was over 8,000 men under strength in infantry alone, and Patton ordered 5% of all his non-divisional units to be converted and retrained as riflemen. The remedies that followed were a testament to how far the system would bend before it broke. Rear echelon clerks, truck drivers, and anti-aircraft gunners were pulled from their posts and retrained as infantrymen. Surplus Air Force's ground personnel were combed out and sent forward, and on December 26, 1944, in the middle of the bulge, Lieutenant General John Lee issued a call inviting black soldiers serving in support and service units to volunteer for frontline infantry combat. The only condition was that NCOs had to accept reduction to the rank of private or private first class. 4,562 men volunteered. They were organized at the 16th Reinforcement Depot at Compiègne, trained as rifle platoons, and deployed as a 4th platoon in selected white infantry companies. It was the first time since the Civil War that black and white American soldiers fought side by side in integrated combat units. And it happened not because of any moral awakening, but because the pipeline needed bodies, and these men were willing to go. Now consider what was happening on the other side of the line. And this is where the story turns. because the conventional understanding of the German replacement system gets something important exactly backward. The German army did not send individual strangers to unfamiliar units. In fact, the German system was specifically designed to do the opposite. The Ersatzheer, the replacement army, was organized across 17 military districts called Wehrkreise, and each district was tied to specific field divisions. When a soldier was drafted in Franconia, he was trained in Franconia, assigned to a Franconian replacement battalion, and sent forward in a March battalion, a Marschbataillon, to a Franconian division at the front. He arrived knowing men from his own region. He shared their dialect, their customs, their local identity. The field replacement battalion at the division level, the Feldersatzbataillon, served as a buffer, giving the new man a few days of acclimatization and instruction in the division's specific tactics before forwarding him to a line company. On paper, this was a better system than the American one. It was more humane. It preserved unit cohesion. It honored the relationship between a soldier and the men he fought beside. And it lost the war. Hold that contradiction in your mind. The system that was better for the soldier lost. The system that was worse for the soldier won. That contradiction is the deepest answer this video can give you. And understanding why it was true requires understanding what happened to the German replacement pipeline in the second half of 1944. In June and July of that year, two catastrophes struck the Wehrmacht simultaneously. On the Eastern Front, Operation Bagration destroyed Army Group Center, consuming 28 divisions in a matter of weeks. In France, the Normandy breakout and the Falaise pocket shattered the German armies in the West. The combined losses were so enormous that the territorial replacement system, the careful Wehrkreis to division pipeline, simply broke. There were not enough trained men in the home districts to fill the gaps. There were not enough instructors to train new ones. And on July 20th, 1944, the assassination attempt against Hitler, launched from inside the replacement army itself by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, caused the entire organization to be purged. Generaloberst Friedrich Fromm, who had commanded the replacement army since 1939, was removed. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, took over. What followed was improvisation at a scale that no professional army should ever have to attempt. The Wehrmacht created a new category of division called the Volksgrenadier Division. 78 of them were formed. They were smaller than standard divisions, roughly 10,000 men instead of 15,000, built around a small cadre of surviving veteran officers and NCOs, and then filled out with whatever the replacement army could supply. Former Luftwaffe ground crews, Kriegsmarine sailors whose ships no longer existed, recovered wounded who had been discharged months earlier, teenagers, old men. Some Volksgrenadier divisions received as little as 6 weeks of training before being sent to the front. The 272nd Volksgrenadier Division was up to 50% former Luftwaffe and Navy personnel, though it fought credibly because it retained experienced leadership from the old 272nd Infantry Division. And then, in October 1944, came the Volkssturm. Hitler decreed a national militia of all males aged 16 to 60 not already in uniform. The target was 6 million men. It was never reached. Recruits received as little as 48 hours of instruction. Many were issued only an armband over civilian clothes. Some carried hunting rifles. Some carried nothing at all. Hitler himself admitted that such units had little fighting value when left to themselves. This was what the German replacement system had become by the winter of 1944. Not the careful territorial pipeline that had sustained the Wehrmacht through Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. A desperate scavenging operation. A system that had been designed to send men from Franconia to Franconian divisions was now sending sailors from the Baltic to infantry divisions in the Ardennes, with 6 weeks of training and weapons they had never fired. And across the line, the American system was doing what it had always done, grinding forward, filling holes, sending one more man, and then another, and then another. The deepest reason the German army could not match this had nothing to do with the design of their replacement pipeline. The design was, by most measures, superior. The reason was scale. The American system treated manpower the way American industry treated raw material, as a commodity to be processed, standardized, and distributed through a pipeline that never stopped running. It was a mass production philosophy applied to human beings. It was ugly, it was dehumanizing, and it was exactly what a war of attrition demanded. The German system was a craftsman's model. It depended on regional identity, veteran mentorship, and the slow accumulation of experience passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. It produced better integrated replacements, but it could not produce them fast enough. And when the stock of veteran NCOs and junior officers, the men who made the system work, was finally exhausted, there was nothing left to build on. You cannot mass produce a sergeant with 3 years of combat experience. You cannot standardize the instinct that keeps a squad alive under artillery fire. And when those men were gone, the German replacement system, for all its elegance, had nothing to offer but bodies. This was the gap that no amount of organizational reform could close. The German army's own doctrine recognized it explicitly. When a shattered division was pulled from the line for rebuilding, the first priority was always to recover experienced instructors, NCOs, and company-grade officers. Without them, a refitted division was just a collection of men in uniforms, not a fighting unit. By the winter of 1944, Germany had lost so many of these irreplaceable leaders, more than 3 million total casualties by that point in the war, that the pipeline from the Wehrkreise to the front was delivering men who had never been properly taught by men who knew what combat actually looked like. The chain of experience that was supposed to hold the system together had been severed, link by link, across 3 years of fighting on 2 fronts. The German generals who survived the war understood this in retrospect. Friedrich von Mellenthin, a veteran intelligence and operations officer, wrote after the war about facing what he called an enemy possessed of immense and seemingly inexhaustible resources. He was describing the Red Army, but the phrase applied with equal force to the Americans in the West. The sheer volume of manpower and materiel that the American system could deliver to the front was, in German eyes, something closer to a natural force than a military operation. You could not outfight it, you could only try to outlast it, and you could not do that either, because it never stopped. General Hermann Balck, commanding Army Group G in the autumn of 1944, wrote to Field Marshal von Rundstedt that he had never been in command of such irregularly assembled and ill-equipped troops. He attributed his ability to hold the line not to his own forces, but to what he called the bad and hesitating command of the Americans. SS General Max Simon went further, describing American tactics as cautious and systematic, comparing them to workers dismantling a wall by removing one brick at a time. These German commanders could mock American tactical caution precisely because the American system allowed that caution. The Americans did not need to be daring. They did not need to be brilliant. They needed to keep showing up, and they always did. The Americans had bodies too, but they also had a pipeline, and the pipeline never closed. Consider the 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, the newest division in the European theater, activated at Fort Jackson, South Carolina in March of 1943. During 1944, while still training in the United States, the division was forced to give up over 7,000 men, roughly 60% of its strength, to the replacement pool. They were replaced by 1,100 air cadets, 1,500 men from other divisions, 2,500 from disbanded units, and assorted rear echelon personnel. Some of these replacements were still in processing weeks before the division shipped overseas. The 106th arrived in Europe in December 1944 and was placed on a 27-mile front in the Schnee-Eifel, relieving the veteran 2nd Infantry Division. Doctrinal frontage for a division was roughly 5 miles. They were covering 5 times that. When the German offensive struck on December 16th, the 18th Volksgrenadier Division executed a double envelopment that trapped 2 of the 106th 3 regiments, the 422nd under Colonel George Deschenaux, and the 423rd under Colonel Charles Cavender, roughly 7,000 men. They surrendered on December 19th, the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. Private First Class John Kuckel of Company B, 422nd Infantry, had been the division's first combat casualty just 4 days earlier, wounded by shrapnel on December 12th. The division commander, Major General Allen Jones, whose own son, Captain Allen Jones, Jr., served in the surrounded 423rd, suffered a heart attack on December 20th. The 106th Division lost 8,663 casualties in the Bulge, the vast majority as prisoners of war. By any standard the German army recognized, it had ceased to exist. And then the American replacement system did what it was designed to do. The 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments were reconstituted from replacements in France by April of 1945. New men, new sergeants, new equipment, same unit designations, same shoulder patches, same regimental colors. The machine that had hollowed the division out before it ever fought could rebuild it just as quickly. This is what Werner Drexler could not find in his files. Not a weapon, not a tactic, a philosophy. The Americans did not believe that a division was its men. They believed a division was its structure, its designation, its institutional identity, and that the men who filled that structure were, in the coldest possible sense, replaceable. The Germans believed that a division was its men, that the bonds between soldiers were what made a unit fight, and that when those men were gone, the division was gone with them. Both beliefs were true, and the war was decided by which truth mattered more when the casualties reached a scale that neither side had imagined. Hauptmann Werner Drexler survived the war. He was captured by American forces in April of 1945 and spent 14 months in a prisoner of war camp before returning to civilian life. Major General Norman Coda, who commanded the 28th Division through the Hürtgen Forest and the Bulge, retired as a Major General in 1946. He never wrote a memoir. Major General Raymond Barton, who held the 4th Division together on the southern shoulder of the Bulge, with a formation that had already been destroyed once in the Hürtgen, received a personal commendation from Patton. Patton called it the most outstanding accomplishment of the division in the war. Barton retired in 1946 and died in 1963. Major General Walter Lauer commanded the 99th Division, the green checkerboard division that held the northern shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge, despite being outnumbered and untested. His men called in artillery on their own positions at least 6 times to break German attacks. The division's 3rd Battalion of the 395th Infantry was outnumbered roughly 5-1 and inflicted casualties at a ratio of 18-1. The historian John Eisenhower later judged the stand of the 2nd and 99th Divisions on the northern shoulder to be the most decisive action of the entire Ardennes campaign. Private First Class Jack Thomas, a black volunteer who had accepted reduction in rank to serve as a rifleman with the 60th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Division, earned the Distinguished Service Cross on April 9, 1945. He was one of 4,562 black soldiers who had volunteered for frontline infantry service during the replacement crisis, accepting demotion and danger because the pipeline needed men, and they were willing to go. Kurt Vonnegut, a private in the 106th Division captured in the Schnee Eifel, survived the firebombing of Dresden as a prisoner of war, and spent the rest of his life writing about what war does to the people inside it. Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds of the 422nd Infantry, captured in the same surrender, was later named Righteous Among the Nations by Israel for refusing a German order to identify Jewish American prisoners, telling the camp commandant that all of his men were Jews. The American replacement system processed hundreds of thousands of men through its pipeline in the European theater alone. It kept 18 divisions fighting past the point of total destruction. It was hated by nearly everyone it touched. It treated soldiers as interchangeable parts in a machine that never stopped running, and it held the line when nothing else could. The German army built a replacement system that was more humane, more thoughtful, and more respectful of the bond between soldiers. And when the losses exceeded what that system could absorb, it had no answer. It sent sailors to fight as infantry. It sent old men and teenagers to hold positions that veteran divisions could not hold. It printed new names on old unit designations and called them Volksgrenadier divisions, and hoped that the word would carry the weight that the training could not. In one army, a destroyed division was a problem to be solved with paperwork and shipping schedules. In the other, a destroyed division was a death that could not be reversed. The Americans did not build a better army. They built a more replaceable one. And in a war that consumed men faster than any war in human history, replaceable was the only thing that mattered. If someone in your family served in the Second World War, tell me about them in the comments. If they were a replacement, if they arrived at a unit where no one knew their name, and they had to earn their place in a foxhole alongside strangers, their story is part of this one. Every one of those men carried a war inside him. Most of them never said a word about it.